not applied routinely, I cannot imagine. I just cannot imagine. It makes no sense to me.
Let's talk about how it actually cashes out. What do we mean when we say that there are differences? Are you referring to like women get more plea bargains, women are sentenced to less time for the same crime when things are held constant?
Yeah, what happens is, you see, now in legalizing misandry, we looked at both Canadian and American law. They're not very different from European law and various other countries, but we couldn't do everything. So we looked at Canadian and American law, and we found that you cannot legislate today using non-inclusive language. In other words, no law can be made which says women can do this, men can do that, or men can't do this, women can't do. You can't have that. So if you want, nevertheless, to have laws which are applied unequally, you have to couch it in very general language. But then what happens is that when these laws are implemented and interpreted by bureaucracies, that's when things get changed. And it's very easy for bureaucrats to do that. They can say, well, yes, the law says this, but we all know that this happens, and therefore we're going to apply it this way.
Right.
Sure, we have domestic violence laws, and anybody can be, domestically violent, but we all know, don't we, that the main perps are men. Therefore, we can order the police to automatically arrest a man, even if he calls the police saying, my wife is throwing pots and pans at me. The police get there, they will automatically arrest him. They will take him to jail. He will not have a trial unless they find evidence. They can confiscate his goods, his property. They can take away his children. All of this can happen just through bureaucratic channels. Now, so you have laws on the one hand which appear to be gender neutral. Mm-hmm. The way they're implemented and enforced is another matter entirely.
You brought up domestic violence. I'd like to talk about violence for a second. Is doing a lot of work on campuses. I'm constantly seeing posters, in particular at Ryerson right now, about violence. And there are claims made that they don't provide sources that something like 4 to 5 female students will experience some act of violence within a relationship mm-hmm. while they're university students mm-hmm. or that age. No source cited. In your research, is it routine for these kinds of fairly or potentially exaggerated claims mm-hmm. to be made without sources, or is that an exaggerated claim, or is that a fair claim?
Well, I haven't seen this,
The 4 to 5.
I don't know the document, and of course, since the source wasn't indicated, I have no way of knowing. Mm-hmm. What happens very often, I would say in fairly respectable statistical units, is that they'll get figures, but then you have to ask, well, what were the questions that were being asked? If you ask somebody, did somebody hit you in the past year? That's one thing. But then if you ask, have you experienced, being uncomfortable with somebody in the past year? Well, what constitutes discomfort? It could mean somebody hit you. It could mean that somebody just said, you don't look pretty today, or, So the questions asked have to be investigated. That's one major problem. You can jack up statistics sky high if inclusion means that somebody says something you don't like. Of course, everybody has that. Mm-hmm. So that's one problem. The other problem is that violence works the other way too, and men are victims of violence, including domestic violence. They are even more reluctant to report this than women have been. I mean, women don't, who wants to report this kind of thing? But men, in addition to the general stigma of being involved in anything to do with violence, of course, there's the problem of ridicule and the problem of who's going to believe you. You're a man. What man is going to admit my wife beats me up or throws things at me or tosses boiling water at my face? It's a very big problem. And then, of course, even if they do admit that, and even if, but where are they going to go? There are no shelters for men.
But just getting back to for a second to the core issue that you've raised, which is there's another side to it: violence against women. There's also violence against men. This almost creation of a special or favored class of victims. I want to ask you just directly about that. When we talk about human rights and this rights revolution, as Michael Ignatieff would put it, in what sense does a focus on women's rights instead of human rights potentially reinforce sexism rather than dismantle it?
Well, it could. It could. Of course, women usually say, well, women's rights are human rights. And that's true in an abstract sense. But if you have organizations, and there are many organizations that focus entirely on women's rights, then inevitably the idea sinks in that women are a special category of victims. And then, of course, you have all the ideological stuff that grounds that in turn in this basically what I've called the conspiracy theory of history, that all of human history is a titanic conspiracy of men to oppress women. Now, I won't say that most women believe that, or even that most women have even articulated or read that kind of thing, but it's very, very prevalent in the literature. Every woman who takes women's studies will read at least some of this stuff. And and even women who don't buy that theory, it's a very attractive solution to the problem of, well, why is there suffering? Look, that is probably the major question that human beings have asked since we became conscious. Why is there suffering? It's a basic question. Well, one answer to that is, well, somebody made it. Somebody caused all this suffering. If you're religious, then you say, well, an evil God did this. If you're monotheistic, then you say, well, God didn't do it, but the devil did it, or Satan, or some evil influence. But if you're secular, you look for a group. You say, well, it's because of the Jews, or it's because of men, or it's because of black people, or it's a human tendency, unfortunately, to be we defined ideology very carefully. I hope you ask about this.
I will now.
Ideology, we refer to what we call ideological feminism, which is distinct from egalitarian feminism. Egalitarian feminism is based on the idea that, look, we're all equal, we should have equal rights. Okay. But ideological feminism came about the same time that as the transition from the civil rights movement to black power. At the same moment in history is the transition from egalitarian feminism to what we call ideological feminism. And the same basic premises were involved. So one of the defining features of any ideological mentality, and this could be religious, in which case we call it fundamentalism, or secular, it could be on the right or the left, makes no difference, is what we call dualism. Dualism is a mentality which sees the world as polarized between us and them, whoever the them might be. The names are irrelevant, but there's always a them, an other. We are good, we are victims, they are evil, they are oppressors. That's the standard mechanism. And this kind of dualism is what we call a defining feature of any ideology, religious or secular, right or left.
You're walking us right into the third set of questions about your third book, but maybe we could take a 2-minute break because I know you needed to dash out about now. Are you okay to stay?
I think I'm going to stay.
Oh,
wow!
Great.
Oh my God!
I was going to say though, if either of you have to leave, don't feel bad. I don't think.
Yeah, do feel bad.
Feel bad.
No, do feel. This is important.
This
is
really
important.
good,
This is really important.
I should say. But I was just going to say, if you did want to get more information, we're going to be trying to put a group together here. And we're looking for volunteers. So if it's something that interests you, or you just want to get notices about future events, I don't know if you have a sheet, you could just maybe put it on a table there or something. You can just give us your name and email address, and we can send you some updates.
I think I'll Well, I didn't mean to interrupt, Lauren.
No, that's fine. Well, we're gonna edit this together anyway. It's not a big deal. Are you good for another?
Oh,
10
I'm
minutes?
good. Fine.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, let's move into your third book because you've hit duality, conspiracy theories, dualism rather.
Duality is something different.
Okay, that's a good.
Dualism is about
distinction.
conflict between polar. So the yin-yang principle, that's duality. That's complementarity. That has nothing to do with conflict. Dualism is good versus evil.
Okay, with that distinction, and I appreciate that. When you talk about, again, that conspiracy theory of history and the way in which it connects with, let's call it ideological feminism, you have, towards the opening of your third book, Sanctifying Misandry, you say, it is striking that men and maleness are virtually absent from this paradise of women. Here you're referring to the so-called original golden age. And you go on, especially in view of the fact that women often complain nowadays about their own erasure from myth, religious symbolism, and history. Now, you study, in your past especially, a lot about secular myth. So is that a secular myth that is supposed to sort of be a response to this belief that women have been shortchanged in traditional patriarchal religions?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, the third book is about Sanctifying Misandry is about the use of religious rhetoric to do all the things that were done in the first two volumes. Some people who adopt the conspiracy theory of history are secular. And so they'll go through their archaeological work and they'll say, well, we have found early remains in which there are, Venus figurines, and therefore this indicates that they worshipped a goddess, and this was the first religion, and this was a religion of harmony and caring and sharing and all these things, until the dirty old men came in, usurped the priestesses, installed priests, installed a male god or a male pantheon, and that is the beginning of human suffering, and that will only change when we revert back to this great goddess. Now, that's using religious language, but you can use non-religious language for the same thing. Because you can talk about this early state, this paradisian state. You can just say, well, it was an era of harmony and everything, and then there was disharmony, and then in the future there will be utopia informed by feminist principles. Or you can use overtly theological language, what they call theological language, and you can say, well, this original paradise was created under the aegis of this great goddess, then she was overthrown and male pantheons took over, but in the end there will be this return of the great goddess. So it takes both forms, religious and secular.
Dr. Nathanson, the idea of there being an ancient universal great mother goddess, history or pseudo-history?
That's pseudo-history. There's no evidence.
There's just no evidence for it.
Look, in the first place, we know next to nothing about humans before 10,000 years ago. We know almost nothing about them. So if you discover a site that is carbon dated to an earlier period, well, what do you find? You find implements that were made of stone or bone or something that lasts. Well, one conclusion that was drawn was, hey, we don't see any fortifications. Therefore, these people did not have war. But of course, if your fortifications were made out of wood, if you had wooden palisades, well, those would have disappeared long ago. So, the kind of supposition, and Gimbutas, Maria Gimbutas, she was the sort of the focal point of all this research. She wrote this book called The Return of the Goddess and Goddess Civilization, and she was an archaeologist. And she used all these suppositions. Well, let's say that this happened, therefore this must have happened.
Right.
But nobody knows. It's completely, we know nothing about these people. You look at these paintings, these Paleolithic cave paintings in France and Spain. We don't know why the hell we don't know what they were. Maybe they were just decorating the caves. Or maybe there was a cult, a hunting cult. We don't know. So we can speculate a lot, but we don't know. What we do know, we know much more about human societies during the transition from the Neolithic to the early horticultural and agricultural societies. We know more about them because they left a lot more behind. They did a lot more. By the time you get to agriculture, they were building canals, irrigation canals. They were building cities. So we have evidence
The
there.
roots of which we can...
And eventually
explore
some
about.
of them produced writing.
Right.
But before that, we just don't know a lot.
So that's the history. Let's put that to the side, whether that exists.
And by
or
the
not.
way, I should just add that people like Naomi Goldenberg have, now she's a psychologist, but she writes a lot about the goddess or goddesses. Well, one thing, and she spoke here at McGill maybe about 10 years ago, but one of the things that she said was, people questioned her about this. Well, do we have any evidence for this? And she said, well, we don't have a lot of evidence, but we need to build a myth for women.
Right.
Now, for an academic to say that is really striking. Here's an academic, she was employed by a university, and she was saying, well, we don't have much evidence, but we're going to build a myth.
Actually, that gets to my next question, which is, whatever the history was, what is the future that these, as you describe them, goddess ideologues want to see? Is it to build a myth and to just sort of
They clearly have built myths. There's no question about that.
recreate the religious or the mythological foundations
Well,
of
there
society
are some
in this new
yeah,
image,
look,
in their own image?
there are groups of goddess people. They have a cult. They have different names. Some of them join Wicca. Some of them join other groups closely allied. Some of them don't join large organizations, but they meet in small groups. But I mean, there are people who see themselves as recreating some primeval religion.
Right. You towards the conclusion of the book, I think you touch on the idea of the demons, and this is where the men come. This is the role of the men in this kind of new reinvented myth. I think that let's sort of end our exploration of your books with that, because I think that ties it nicely to the first book about spreading misandry and the idea that that the image of man is often as either evil or incompetent. And what I wanted to ask you about is, why do you think it's so obviously seen as sexism when men are portrayed as powerful and as the god, the father figure, sky god, but to have a male figure as the devil, as the demon, as literally evil incarnate, that's not seen as a sexist, misandric kind of image for men?
Well, it's not seen. It is, of course, but people don't see everything. I mean, but I want to just go back one point, because we were talking about men as devil. This is not to say that all of these cults see men in that way. Wicca does in fact have male members, and but there are some that don't. So I'm just saying, I don't want to tar everybody with the same brush. Yes, as for people don't see things. I mean, I can't I'll give you an example, a wonderful example, because it happened only last week. Janet Bagnall wrote an article in the Montreal Gazette about how women have made hardly any gains in 100 years. Now, that's a pretty tough statement to argue, but she tried. And for evidence, she pointed to this series, this BBC series on PBS called Downton Abbey. She said, look, 100 years ago, women couldn't inherit, they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that. And are women really better off today? Well, yes, a little bit, but we have a long, long way to go. In other words, it was the standard idea that women are victims, but they're also heroes. You have your cake and eat it too. Women are victims because, after all, we live in a patriarchal society and there's all this stuff going on. But, of course, women are also heroes because, look, we've achieved things. But they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be victims, but they also want to be heroes. Well, anyway, that was the article. I wrote a letter to the editor about that, and I said, look, it's interesting that Bagnall uses Downton Abbey as her evidence or as her starting point. I mean, she's not a literary critic or anything, but she's using a text, and she's saying, look, here is evidence. Women did this in 1912, women couldn't do this, and now this. But she did not see that this Downton Abbey Yes, it has a storyline about Lady Mary who can't inherit, and therefore there are a lot of plot complications. But the series begins actually with the Titanic, and with the two male heirs who were killed on the Titanic, presumably giving their seats to women. It continues week after week through World War I, in which men are drafted, and how to save the servants from conscription, and then the valet who comes back with shell shock, and there are all these things going on, and she didn't see it.
And when you look at men dying in the Titanic, and you look at
she didn't see it.
And you look at what happened a couple of weeks ago with the Costa Concordia, and there was a whole thing about whether the captain, and there was a lot of focus on whether the protocol of women and children first was observed. Maybe nothing's changed for both genders.
Well, yes. In fact, I think a lot less has changed for men than it has for women. But my only point there was simply that people do not see what is right in front of them unless they are somehow primed to see it. Well, look, 40 years ago, there are a lot of people who said, Betty Friedan, who cares? She's a middle-class woman. Do we really need to listen to this stuff? Well, it took women a long time to get people to take them seriously. The feminist movement didn't just... wasn't immediately recognized by all women as being something they needed or wanted.
Right.
They had to convince women. So here we are. Women at one time could not see problems that Betty Friedan or her successors saw. And now we have people looking at a series like Downton Abbey and simply not seeing half of it.
So this is another good lead into my last round of questions for you, which is the reception that your work's getting. Because if people don't take a long time to see the truth in front of them when you're advocating, or in your case, providing scholarly research in a new area, I can only imagine that sometimes the response can be a little bit less than stellar. And I'm curious how you have been responded to by the university or your peers.
Okay, well, let's start. You want to start with the university and
whatever you'd
peers?
like to
Well,
start with.
I'll tell you this, that Catherine, even within her own faculty, Catherine once had her picture on the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which everybody here gets, automatically. They're all members. Her picture was on the front cover. There was a story about her and some of the research that we've been doing. Not one person on the faculty mentioned it to her. Even said, "Oh, Catherine, I liked your picture." And nothing. It was completely deaf, stone deaf. She has people on the campus who won't talk to her. Now, I paradoxically got less of that because my status is I'm not a tenured. I have less status than she has, and also I'm not a member of the club. I'm not. She can be accused of being a traitor to her sex. I'm just another man. So she gets actually more hostility than I do.
That's interesting, because you might think the opposite would happen.
Well,
that she'd be allowed to experiment more
in a way,
gender discourse.
They are not surprised when they hear men saying things that they can't stand. But when a woman says it, hey, what's going on here? Who the hell is this woman talking like this? So
she, double standard,
and Barbara Kay gets the same kind of hostility.
Yeah, she certainly did for us.
I am easier to silence in a way than Catherine. Although, frankly, if you want to talk about silencing, we've certainly had trouble getting published. I mean, most people will send their manuscripts to 2 or 3 publishers, and if they're reasonably well written, they'll get published. Well, we have had to shop around dozens of publishers. People won't touch us. So that's
the McGill University Press.
McGill because there happens to be, by accident, one person at the press, and he happens to be the head, Phil Cerconi. He's interested in what we're doing, and he's interested in a whole lot of unconventional things. He wants to build the press up as a kind of, controversial and interesting press.
Right.
But had it not been for him, we would be nowhere. We wouldn't get grants, because every grant application has to pass through committees, and on the committee are invariably, well, certainly women, but also feminists. And even feminists who are egalitarian and, you know, not hostile, but they look at our stuff and they say, where is this stuff coming from? Where's it going? Do we want this? No. Who's going to buy it? It's politically incorrect. Whatever the reason is, it's hard. It's always harder to get.
Politically incorrect and nobody will buy it? That doesn't usually,
Yeah,
that doesn't seem so consistent.
well, that's. Yeah,
This is why I wonder why the
will buy.
newspapers
Some
don't,
people will buy
discuss this
politically incorrect
perspective.
stuff, but it won't be bought for university libraries. It won't.
Right.
That's the
It
problem.
won't be introduced into classrooms.
That's
and
right.
that sort of thing. Well,
Which is where most of the money comes from. These are not books that people take to read on the beach in Hawaii. These are they're textbooks. They're
you
for
might get stopped
universities.
at the security checkpoint. It's quite large too. Professor Nathanson, I think we're going to perhaps take a few questions if there's interest there. But I want to thank you. And again, it's a trio of books right now. You have 2 more coming out. So far, it's.
I want to talk about those.
Yeah, please. Give me the names again.
We've
of those
mentioned
2.
Transcending Misandry. That's
Okay.
the final volume. That leads up to dialogue. But the second to last, the penultimate volume, which was originally part of this, they were all both part of one volume, is called Replacing Misandry. And that is where we, because the first 3 volumes are all about, you know, what we have to unlearn about men.
Right.
That volume is really starting over from scratch. So we start with, it's a history of men, starting with the transition to horticulture and the agricultural revolution. So we're going back 10,000 years, and we're saying that the problems that men have today, and they do have problems, these were not entirely or even mainly invented by feminism. Feminists have exacerbated a problem that began 10,000 years ago. And the problem has to do with technological and cultural revolutions, a series of them. So the subtitle of the book is A Revolutionary Theory. So the agricultural revolution, one of the things that it did was that it made cities possible. Because people could store food, people could live together.
Yeah.
The amount of food increased so you could have larger populations. That in turn meant that some organization, a more sophisticated level of organization was involved. That led to the rise of monarchies. And of course, all of these things made it much more likely to have war because it made it profitable. If you had settled communities, they weren't moving around, they were just settled, then a neighboring community could say, well, look, we want that land, that's fertile land. So they would, so all of those things went together. And as a consequence, you have specialization. You had the beginning, but only the very faint beginning, of a process by which masculine identity became increasingly divorced from the male body. Because what you had was, you still had, all the peasants were still tilling their land. That required muscles. Men had to pull steel plows around. And at the other end, at the level of the aristocracy, you still had warfare. And so you needed male bodies for that. At least they thought they did. In those days they did. But in between, you had these new classes developing. People who were specialized in writing, for example, or artisans. People who did not need muscles. And that led to the development of sort of specialization in which women would not be allowed into some of those specializations because if they did, then men would have no way of forming identity, masculine identity. Now, that was very minor 10,000 years ago, but as the centuries went on, especially when you get to the Industrial Revolution, that became very, very prevalent. Look, you had factories replacing muscle. You had machines replacing muscle. You had women and children working in the mines and the mills until that was outlawed to protect them. What you had was, at the lowest stratum of society were men who had to use their muscle. At the highest end were men who didn't have to work. They just, okay. Then the next revolution, and in some ways it's the most important and the least known, we call it the military revolution. It involved partly technological change, the use of, rifles, guns, and cannon. Right. But more important than any technological change was what happened with the social contract changed. Because what happened with the French Revolution was that the idea was that citizens of the new republic would get full citizenship. But the cost of full citizenship was that they were to be soldiers for the revolution. So universal conscription. Of course, that's never universal. It was universal male conscription. So the deal was that men got privileges of citizenship at the cost of their lives, and women did not get full citizenship because they didn't go to war, but they also got protection. So that was the social contract. And that applies, really, it's even being questioned today. It's still prevalent. I mean, should women serve in the armed forces? And not only should they serve, but should they be forced to serve?
Should they be in combat roles?
That's
That was a question in the last Republican presidential debate.
And even if they should be in combat roles, there's the question of whether they should be drafted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one and only law in the States that still differentiates by sex is the legal requirement to register for selective service, which is conscription. Only men have to do
Which
that
is
on their
obligatory
18th
when you turn
birthday.
18,
That's
yeah.
obligatory, and failing to do is a serious offense. It's a federal offense.
Yeah.
It can affect your entire life. You don't get any grants. You can't get you can't work for the government. So that's the one exception that somehow nobody seems to acknowledge, but it's there. It's in law.
More things in front of your face that you don't know.
That's right.
that you don't
Who
know.
sees it?
So that's going to be replacing misandry? Is that the title?
That's in the yes. Replacing misandry it's a new history of men, and then of course it concludes with what you could call the biological revolution, and that is interesting because we have technologies that make it questionable that we even need fathers or even need men for reproduction.
Right.
We have, and on the horizon are technologies such as parthenogenesis, in which you can create a new person without a sperm. So
It's a lot of topics for one book.
yeah.
Maybe your thickest
well,
book yet.
Well, that stuff came out of our earlier research on reproductive technologies. But I'm just trying to say that these are cultural changes and technological changes that have made it very difficult for men to have a healthy identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make, I'm sorry for taking up your time, but I need to say this.
Yeah, go ahead.
We define a healthy identity, not only for men, but for anybody, not only for individuals, but for groups. A healthy identity means the ability to make at least one contribution to the larger society that is A, distinctive, B, necessary, and C, publicly valued. Now, if you cannot do that, you cannot have a healthy identity. And if you cannot have a healthy identity, then there are repercussions. So what happens today, we have some men who are basically giving up, which explains, I think, to a large extent, the high suicide rate. And also, another possibility is for men to say, well, if I can't have a healthy identity, I'll have an unhealthy one, thank you very much. Those are the men who act up. Those are the men who turn against society. They become criminals. They abandon society that they think has abandoned them. So these are very significant repercussions of the main problem, which we define as how do you give men a healthy identity at a time when it is almost impossible to say that in public, because the minute you say a distinctive identity, a distinctive contribution, then that flies in the face of the idea that women can do everything men can do.
Right.
In that case, if men and women are interchangeable, then how do you get men to have a healthy identity? It's a big problem. And we suggest that the only possibility for a healthy identity would be focused on fatherhood. Okay? If there is a need for fathers, if there is a distinctive role, and we think there is, for fathers, then that's at least one thing that women are not going to claim. Okay? Now, it's an iffy thing, because, some people are claiming, no, even fatherhood is irrelevant. Any two women, any two people, a man and a dog, anybody can be a parent. Okay? So that's the rhetoric that is out there now, but it's not yet in place. So we